mainly. I also write books, and I've been covering neuroscience, psychology, and especially addictions for a very long time. And it's got to be 20 years, which is kind of scary. So the thing that I'd like to talk about a little bit here is the concept of disease mongering and the idea of medicalization, which is a big issue in medical blogging. Because on the one hand, you have people who, and large companies, who want to sell you a disease. And on the other hand, you have people who genuinely have that disease. One of the classic examples here is restless leg syndrome. Everybody completely makes fun of this. Everybody thinks that it's a fake illness and that it's made up by pharma so that they can sell these drugs. But if you talk to the people who really suffer from it, you get a completely different picture. And so, you know, the medicalization issue is often presented as a black and white thing, and the evil drug companies on one side and the victim patients on the other. And I want to say that it's more complicated than that. I have been looking at this a lot lately with regard to opioid painkillers. And this is a huge thing because most of the coverage of painkillers in America right now is about addiction. I'll just throw out the question here. What % of people do you guys think who take painkillers for pain become addicted? Okay.
1%.
Okay, you know the answer.
I know the answer.
Show off.
I would imagine that most people don't.
But I would bet you that most doctors don't know the answer either, and that's the problem.
Yes, yes, and there's an enormous problem here because virtually all the coverage is focused on addiction and teenagers misusing these drugs and people dying of overdose. What % of people who die of overdose would you guess are painkiller patients, or are genuine pain patients making a mistake? Anybody have a guess?
It's less than 1%.
This actually might be a little bit more, but something like 95% of the people who die of overdose have usually mixed it with alcohol, with benzodiazepines, and they're snorting or injecting rather than taking the doses prescribed. But again, when you see the headlines, it's overdose now kills more people than car accidents. And then you get into the question of who's funding things. And there's been a lot of coverage lately about how people, the patient advocates have been funded by the drug companies, so therefore, they must simply be victims and pushing the agenda of the drug companies. Now, the drug companies do lots of evil stuff, and I'm certainly not going to defend them in terms of that, but the other side here is that we have this bizarre conception of responsibility, such that patients are disempowered and seen as victims of these larger forces, and the physicians are overempowered such that we get the concept of a physician can turn somebody into an addict, which is actually impossible. I could take anybody in this room and shoot them up with heroin, for 3 weeks, and all of you guys would become physically dependent. The vast majority of people, after they escaped from the evil scientists who did such a thing, would be like, oh, yuck, I don't want to do this. And they'd have a flu-like experience and go on. But that is not the impression we get. And when you hear, again, about the people who become addicted to painkillers, the overwhelming impression is that they, broke their leg, they went to the doctor, they had chronic back pain, and, somehow they got hooked. Again, you get this massive, something like 80% have a prior history of serious drug abuse problems. So, if you go to your doctor and you don't admit that you have a previous drug abuse problem and then you become addicted, I don't think it's really fair to blame the doctor in that sort of situation. The other thing I think is really interesting that sort of spurs off from this is, we were talking earlier about Dr. Drew and his diagnosis of Charlie Sheen. The first thing, of course, he diagnosed him with was a relapse of addiction. And again, without seeing the guy, without knowing what was going on, without, and then later he comes up with the bipolar thing because it's clear that the guy hasn't.
I didn't know that, actually.
Yeah, and because the guy he tested negative
Not
for
only
drugs.
diagnosed him, but from a distance, he diagnosed him twice from a distance.
Oh, yeah, no. And I mean, now comes word that he got about $100,000 in the last 2 years from pharma. Dr. Drew, while supposedly being an objective reporter covering psychiatric issues. And what did he take this drug company money for? He took it to do a
As a historian.
What's that?
As a historian.
Oh, as a historian, yes, that's right. Like Newt Gingrich. Apparently he took this money for a anti-drug campaign against prescription drug misuse in teenagers. What's interesting about this is that we have very different standards for judging whether pharma money is a bad influence when it comes to the bad drugs. Because the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, which was seen as this objective organization that was, out there fighting the good fight, virtually all its funding for the first few years came from pharma. And virtually in its first 10 years in existence, the organization never attacked alcohol or tobacco. Another organization, the National Center on Substance Abuse and National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse at Columbia, also took pharma money. They actually took money from Purdue, who makes OxyContin, to do their big anti-drug campaign. And in all of these instances, they don't get called out for it because they're supposed to be fighting the drug war, and so in that instance, the drug money is not seen as a corrupting influence. All of these things are very specific to the areas I cover, obviously, but I think that they should raise some questions about how we look at these issues as health and science writers and how we determine who is taking a position and who is objective and what objective really is. I think that a lot of the time we as journalists get confused and think that if it's conventional wisdom, therefore it's objective. And I've often been accused of being not objective when I use statistics like the 1% of pain patients who become addicted, because that isn't in the conventional wisdom, and bringing that up changes the story in a way that is not what you see in a lot of the other coverage. So I would urge all of you to, well, actually I want to say one more thing. The other thing that I think is a frequent challenge as a medical blogger is to put things in context. I have to write every day, which is insane. So I often, I try not to do this, but sometimes I have to cover a subject that I'm not especially familiar with. And then I might miss the fact that this is one study and there's been 99 studies showing the opposite. Recently, a colleague of mine covered this new study on nicotine replacement not being very effective. Now, virtually all of the coverage of this story was about this one study. And this was an observational study. There have been several hundred clinical trials showing that nicotine replacement is effective. And virtually none of the stories that none of the people who covered this, I think with the exception of WebMD, actually put it in context. And I think it's really important that we know the standards of medical evidence and that we know that an observational study, well, what probably was going on here is that the people who have real difficulty quitting turn to nicotine replacement. And then that will actually help them do better than if they hadn't, but it will still not help them do better than the people who quit easily anyway. But meanwhile, we have a big, storm of coverage ignoring all of the other research and just focusing on this one study. So one of the things I think is really important to do, even if you have an insane deadline, just do PubMed on the one study and see what the other studies are. Look at